Hi, my name is Lachlan Wilson. Today I'm going to be talking about my project report, which was done on the Victoria Park Vultures Football Club, which is a soccer club based in Ballarat. A few of the key points that I'm going to be talking about is in what way does the soccer club differentiate culturally from other amateur sporting clubs. Specifically, I want to talk about Aussie rules football clubs, amateur clubs, and yeah. Another point is, does the variance in ethnicity and nationality when comparing the two sporting codes and their participation rates contribute to a different cultural landscape and makeup? Again, this is between the Vic Park Soccer Club and other Aussie rule clubs that I've had experience with. So another point is, in what ways does cultural capital contribute to misogynistic behaviour, and is it less prevalent in soccer clubs than in football clubs? And my last point that I'd like to address is, in what ways does the soccer club serve as a social outlet for young men as well as a physical outlet? Do people play for one reason or the other, or is it a combination of the two? So, just to get started with, the setting of my research site was the Victoria Park Football Club. It's an amateur soccer club that participates in the Ballarat and District Soccer Association competition. They're based in Victoria Park, but due to ground availability, play the majority of their matches at Moorshead Park. Victoria Park, or Vic Park as they are more commonly known, have an ethnically diverse cast of players. There is a large British contingent. About a third of the squad is made up of overseas players who are from either Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, and then there's a whole another group of players at the club who are only separated by a generation or two from their British ancestry. There's a pretty diverse sort of socioeconomic makeup amongst this group. Some of them come from very, very dire kind of circumstance where they were more or less forced to, not exactly forced to come to Australia, but they're forced to seek greener pastures economically. They're by no means refugees, but they definitely didn't have a lot going for them back home financially or socially. I know at least one of the players doesn't really have much of a family and sort of came across the pond to Australia and used the club as kind of a launching pad for a social life, which I think is quite common. Some of the other British players do come from quite wealthy backgrounds, and that's pretty common, I think. They tend to be a bit older. The majority of them, they're sort of over 30. They've sort of made their money, and they've come to Australia, or they've used their qualifications, so they're well educated and they've got jobs here. So they use the club again. It's similar in that it's a social setting for them. But yeah, and I think it's because it is a game that they play back home. They can use that as a kind of touching pad for where they're from. There's also a smattering of African players. These are mostly refugees or immigrants who've come to work and who are sort of, if not fleeing their country, they're definitely pursuing far greater opportunity in Australia than they would have back home. They're definitely amongst the quieter players. A lot of them, English is their second language. Some of them don't speak English barely at all. So they tend to be either studying or working some kind of apprenticeship here, labour job. And then there is the rest of the players, for the majority are Australian born, or there's a few New Zealanders as well, but it's a pretty kind of diverse group of people. So this ethnic diversity is pretty different to my experience of playing Australian rules football. I found that the ratios there, they skew far more to the Australian-born Western sort of persuasion. So I think that, I don't know if this directly correlates, but one thing that I found was the club had less overt racism. I know when I used to play footy, there was jokes, kind of derogatory racial jokes were pretty common. You'd hear them almost sort of daily. So there's not as much of that, and I wonder if that perhaps is because of a sensitivity to the broad range of people that are at the club. I think that there is still an element of racism within the club. Part of it, there's definitely an attitude towards the African players that they're often sort of labelled as lazy, but simultaneously described as very skillful. So it becomes this stereotype where the African players are all innately very good at soccer, but they don't have the work rate or the work ethic that the local players or the British players might have, which I found quite interesting, because there actually were quite a lot of very technically gifted and very technically skilled African players who sort of struggled to maintain a place in the team. They'd kind of be in and out of the side, and I think partly that is because of that they don't maybe fit in the team structure, but I think it's probably more to do with their they don't speak the language as well. There's a lot of issues that they might be facing outside of the club that people may not appreciate. I had on one night there was a Scottish-born player who was pretty new to the club. He was very drunk, and he basically said to me, like, all African players are lazy and they're all kind of this, that, and the other thing. So it's definitely there. It's under the surface a little bit, but it really reminds me of the attitude in local footy clubs towards Aboriginal players, where they're often kind of described as being super skillful but too lazy. They don't have the work rate. But it's the kind of thing that you even hear commentators saying, and they talk about, if Eddie Betts on the weekend kicks a freakish banana goal, they'll say, "Oh, that's magical. That's magic." Or Dan Rioli kicks a freak goal. It's he's a freak. He's magic, and it kind of it's almost doing them a disservice, because it's kind of saying, these players are born with this skill. They didn't earn anything, and I think the commentators they probably enjoy being able to say that in a way. I mean, I could be making leaps here, but it does strike me as this kind of sort of subtle racism where you're actually complimenting them, but at the same time it's with a caveat, like they're only kind of good because they're sort of born good, or something like that. I just think it's an interesting point that definitely has kind of translated between the two sporting codes. But yeah, it's just a thought. Another thing that I found was pretty different was the attitude towards women in the clubs. It was pretty striking. I remember playing footy just 3 years ago for a club in Ballarat, and I was pretty taken aback by the overt sexism that was just routine. a lot of humour. It was a lot of sort of misogynistic based humour, but it would, just really, really derogatory comments about, players' wives, sisters, girlfriends, cousins, that kind of thing. Like, routine posting of photos on the Facebook group page of other players' sisters or whatever it was. Every time the netballers play, the affiliated netball club will play, everyone would sort of go over and start, commenting, catcalling, that kind of thing. But it pretty much didn't happen at Vic Park that I observed. There's a women's club, a women's team that plays for the club as well, and they play on the same day as the men, and they go to all the same social groups, and they don't train together, but they're treated with at least a modicum of respect. That's not to say, I think there's probably going to be issues anywhere. It's a group of men, and that's not to say they're perfect by any stretch, but it definitely was a factor. I think it maybe more so the fact that the footy team was so overtly sexist that it kind of shocked me a bit. But yeah, so that was one thing. And I just wanted to kind of relate that back to my earlier query about cultural capital and what role that plays. And I think that one thing I've noticed at the club is that there are a few older players, and I think that a lot of them kind of, I don't know if it's maybe a bit of a white collar sporting code in a way. It's quite expensive. A lot of them are sort of not wealthy but well off expats that are kind of, they've come over. They're playing a bit of soccer on the weekend kind of thing. They've got their social life based around the club. But I think maybe there's education might be a factor as well. But I think there's definitely like a little bit more cultural capital, a little bit more worldliness about some of the players. And it's not to say that the local footy teams are completely, they're not. It's not that they're sort of working class. It's more that there's just a lack of social awareness, I think, that goes with them, and that could just be, it's a country town. There's less need for imports from overseas to join the club. The footy teams here are chockers with players. So it's just a thought that maybe it might have something to do with the different attitudes regarding race and gender. I just wanted to sort of touch on briefly about the team existing as a kind of social hub for players, particularly the older players I found, and not so much the younger players. There's definitely like a big drinking culture, which is pretty prevalent amongst all sports. That wasn't really much different to the footy clubs that I played for. Although the one thing I would say is that it's probably skewed a bit more towards the older players than the younger players compared to, say, a footy club. For whatever reason, the soccer club, Vic Park, their functions kind of revolved around that sort of 30 to 35 year old bracket of players. So whatever reason that may be, and I think maybe it's like a wider generational thing where they might be drinking less, and the younger players aren't really interested in socialising in that way, and perhaps it is more of a physical outlet for them, and it's kind of interesting to see, because I think it is in some ways that the older the players got, and it was more of a social setting for them and less so a physical kind of outlet. So I think that it's kind of interesting to think that maybe the older players could perhaps do a bit more to sort of make the social events a bit more accessible for the young players, because they do kind of revolve around alcohol. And I think there probably is a slightly changing landscape in Australia in regards to that. I know teen drinking's meant to be down and stuff like that, so yeah, just an interesting point. So I've also got a few photos and stuff that I've taken of the club. I would have shown them throughout the presentation, but there's no class here, so I'm just going to link them in a separate PDF. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks for listening. Give us an HD or just a pass.